So after I finished all the quests available in Luna 1, I decided to sit down and read through a Finnish epic called the Kalevala because, well, Nod-Krai is full of references to Finnish folklore and mythology, especially in the Hymns of the Far North book. And the Kalevala is one of the most well-known compilations of Finnish folklore that you can get in English. While it is technically just a single person's attempt at creating a linear narrative out of a collection of incomplete or inconsistent runic hymns, I figured it would still be a great place to start. Now understand that I was primarily doing this for my own benefit, but as I finished the Kalevala and began to broaden the scope of my research, it occurred to me that I should probably share my findings with you guys. Not because they're particularly mind-blowing or anything, but because their references are pretty fun and also really interesting, and I like learning new things. And if you're watching this channel, you probably do too. Now that said, I did end up finding so many things that my findings have exceeded 20,000 words. So I've just picked some of my favorite bits and compiled them into this video. The rest of it I'm gonna toss in another video, which is gonna be more of a full-fledged theory based on some details that I found in Hymns of the Far North and some other assorted locations. So if I gloss over a topic or just don't mention something in this video, it's probably because I've put it in the other one. But before we jump into things, I would like you to know that this educational experience has been sponsored by the winner of the Gamescom 2025 Best Mobile Game Award, Love and Deep Space. If you're unfamiliar with this game, Love and Deep Space is a highly interactive and story-driven 3D otome dating sim / sci-fi action game with a lot of spice to it. If you're pure of heart, be forewarned. The story follows a fully customizable, nameless main character whose world faces a monstrous threat originating from somewhere in the depths of space. In your role as the main character, you will become a hunter in order to fight off these deep space monsters called Wanderers with the help of 5 pretty men in order to uncover the mysteries of the monster's origins and your past, all while trying to navigate alternate realities, timelines, and other space anomalies by dating the men who fight alongside you. The combination of these alternate reality storylines and a heavy focus on customization provides a lot of variety and novel experiences for players, whether it's just decorating your room or coordinating the outfits between you and your main squeeze. Or when you need a break from the intense storylines or fighting monsters, you can go on dates with the boys, playing small mini games or just having a nice conversation. Currently, Love and Deep Space has a brand new alternate world storyline featuring Zane. In this storyline, Zane is the god of annihilation, and his relationship with the main character is not at all what it appears to be on the surface. And if you pull for Zane's memory card, you'll be able to unlock his god of annihilation form in combat and get access to some, amorous moments. And if that intrigues you, then check out the link in the description to experience Love and Deep Space for yourself. A big thanks to Love and Deep Space for sponsoring this video, and now we are off to our little corner of the universe where we're going to talk about all the references to Finnish mythology that we can find in Nod-Krai. Well, maybe not all of them, but as many as I feel like. And with those expectations set, I will remind you that timestamps and spoiler warnings can be found in the description box as always, and without further ado, let's get things started. Also, I'm sorry for the many ways in which I am about to butcher a bunch of different languages. Okay, so like I said, most of Nod-Krai seems to be pulling from Finnish folklore, so we're gonna start things off by going through the names of Teyvat's highest ranked deities as they are found in Hymns of the Far North while I explain most of the relevant aspects of the Finnish pantheon. And of course, we have to start with the oldest and greatest deity of all, the big dragon daddy himself, Nibelung. Hymns of the Far North call him Iannikoinen or Takoja Iannikoinen. Now, both variations of this name refer to Ilmarinen, which is one of Finnish mythology's oldest deities and creator gods. Ilmarinen falls into the Sky Father category, similar to figures like Odin or Zeus. And as a creator deity, he's credited with having forged the sun, moon, and sky, which is why he's also frequently depicted as a blacksmith or an inventor. So when Hymns of the Far North call Iannikoinen the primeval blacksmith, they're making a very direct reference to Ilmarinen. Now, Ilmarinen is actually a great name for Nibelung, since the latter is a creator god with deep alchemical connections, and alchemy seems to be Teyvat's primary method of creation magic. Plus, he's also credited with forging the bones of the earth and a great sky chariot, and if Hymns of the Far North is accurate, then he also likely made the celestial nails that can mend or destroy the world. He also made the moons, and he either is or probably made the sun, just like Ilmarinen, and that makes me wonder if the initial firmament was also made by Nibelung, given how Ilmarinen also forged the dome of the sky. It would make a lot of sense to me if Nibelung was the one to raise the initial barrier in the sky, because it probably would have provided Teyvat with some level of protection against the abyss while he was gone investigating stuff in deep space. Now, mythology isn't static. It evolves over time as external and internal forces influence the storytellers who pass these myths along. And as a result of these influences, Ilmarinen experienced a transformation into Ukko Ilmarai, which means something like Grandfather Sky or Skyfather. Ilmarinen also seems to have subsequently been split into the sky deity Ukko and the culture hero / blacksmith Ilmarinen, and this was probably due to the influence of Christianity as it moved into Finland. So in later depictions, including the Kalevala, many of Ilmarinen's creator deity accomplishments are reattributed and split between Ukko and Väinämöinen. Väinämöinen was known as being a great warrior and a bard with magic songs, and he greatly resembles the Norse god Odin, so you can safely think of him in those terms. But I'm gonna make a bit of a theoretical leap here and suggest that Väinämöinen is actually analogous to the heavenly principles in Genshin for a couple of reasons. First, Väinämöinen is a later development in Finnish folklore, and he absorbed a lot of Ilmarinen's creator aspects, as I said. This is pretty similar to how the heavenly principles usurped Nibelung's authority. Additionally, hymns of the far north call the heavenly principles Pitkämunen, which is another name for Ukko, another recipient of Ilmarinen's creator aspects. However, in the runic songs where Pitkämunen is mentioned, Väinämöinen is often mentioned in his place, so I'm kind of conflating the two here. There are more reasons for this that I would love to dive into, but I'm gonna save that for my second video. Now, all that said, I'm not 100% sure if there's a mythological or folklore explanation for the whole Lord of Seven Calamities title that Pitkämunen has. I did a lot of reading and I couldn't really find anything, so I think that might be Genshin specific. In fact, it might just be referring to the 7 Gnosis, because the 7 Gnosis attract calamities, and there are 7 of them. And the Heavenly Principles was the one responsible for splitting the third descender into those 7 pieces. Okay, so now that we've talked about the 2 highest powers of the land, Nibelung and the Heavenly Principles, let's move on to their subordinates, starting with the 4 Shades. Hymns of the Far North give some new names for the Shades as well, except for Asmodee, as her hymn has been redacted. Because of course they're not gonna give us the hymn for the shade that we're most curious about. That would be way too easy. So let's just talk about the ones we do have. Naberius is given the name Mataraka, which translates into Origin Woman, a fertility goddess from Sami shamanism. Now, I really wish I had some more interesting facts about her to share, but I really couldn't find much beyond a loose connection to the Finnish goddess of the earth, Maema, and that's only noteworthy because she's sometimes called Ukko's mother or wife and is generally depicted alongside of a sun, kind of like a moon. It really just depends on the myth. Maema is also the mother of snakes, which in my opinion fits with Rhine-daughter being the mother of dragons, and since Rhine-daughter has fused with Naberius, I think that's kind of a relevant point. As for Mataraka herself, well, all I can really add here is that the Sami people, who are indigenous to Norway, Sweden, Finland, and parts of Russia, have a lot of traditions surrounding reindeer, which I find quite interesting in the context of the Frostmoon Scions and their deer traits. It doesn't really link back to Naberius though, so take that for what you will. Now, Hymns of the Far North grants Renova the name Tuonetar, which literally means Lady Death. It's pretty on the nose and there's not much to add here, except that in the Kalevala, Tuonetar is in possession of the Brew of Oblivion, which essentially wipes the memories of anyone who drinks it. This is extremely similar to the effects of Arlecchino's Bale Moon Bloodfire, which does the exact same thing. And I feel like that matters because Arlecchino seems to have some kind of curse or blessing tied directly to Renova, or at least to the root of Renova's powers, which may or may not be found in the Crimson Moon. Once again, though, this name is pretty straightforward. Istaroth, on the other hand, has a rather peculiar name given to her here. Laimelia, or Laima, a name that means luck or beginning. The reason why I find this name so curious and such a weird choice is because Laima is a Baltic goddess of fate, quite similar to the Greek Moirai or Nordic Norns. And much like Laima's Greek and Nordic counterparts, she's sometimes part of a trinity. And that really makes me wonder if Hoyoverse is hinting at her connections to the moons, since they are the ones who are generally compared to the triple fate goddesses. Curiously though, when she is a part of a trinity, Laima was assigned the role of predicting a human's life, while Dahlia monitored the actual manifestation of that prophecy she made, and Giltnane decided when life would end. I just find this an odd choice of name for a time goddess, although Hymns of the Far North does call her someone who is never born and who will never die. So it does kind of feel like she's stuck at a single point of origin and maybe viewing all possible futures all at once. And maybe that's why she has a name that means beginning. I could kind of get behind that. But also, it really bothers me that her hymn talks about 4 imprisoned moons while there are only 3 moons everywhere else. Like, I know that Nod-Krai is technically built upon the remains of an unborn 4th moon, but if it's not born, then is it also imprisoned? A question for another time, perhaps. Anyway, that's all I have on the shade, so let's move on to the moons and sealies that we have new names for. So when we're dealing with Finnish, whenever you see the suffix of tar, you can immediately translate it into lady or maiden in your head. As an example, Renova's second name, Tuonetar, is made up of Tuone, which means death, and Tar, which means lady or maiden, hence Lady Death. So if we look at Kutar, we can break it down again. Ku means moon, Tar means maiden, and that's why she is called the Moon Maiden. Likewise, the full title of the Frost Moon is Hurekutar, which literally translates into Maiden of the Frost Moon, because Hure means frost. Similarly, the name of the first angel who fought alongside the Voyager in the war against heaven is called Koitar, wherein Koi means dawn. That makes her the Dawn Maiden, or as she's also called, the Dawn Star, which is actually super funny for a name because the Dawn Star is also a morning star, which is also another name or epithet for Lucifer, who also fought against heaven, just like she did. Although I will argue that if the first angel is Lady Dawn, and there's no real star in her name, and Voyager had stars in their eyes, which is how they are often described, then Voyager is kind of like Lady Dawn's star, so together they would make up the Dawn Star. But honestly, that's just kind of semantics at this point. Although I do think it's very interesting how in a lot of legends in Teyvat about the moons, they say that the moons loved the, quote, stars of daybreak, which would be the dawn stars or the morning stars. So the moons likely thought very highly of both the Voyager and the first angel, the Dawn Maiden. And following our Tar pattern, we also have Luonotar, or Nature Maiden. Luonotar can refer to either the oldest and most primordial female entity in Finnish mythology, or a classification of feminine nature spirits. Whether singular or plural, Luonotar, also known as Kave, are frequently associated with the moon, especially the waxing moon, since as a goddess, Kave is said to chase away the evil Kumet that steals the moon once every cycle. I personally think that this relationship between the Kave and the Luonotar and the moon implies that Kuhenki, or moon spirits, are also a type of Kave, especially since Lauma says that Luonotar is a more evolved or mature form of the Kuhenki. And speaking of moons, over on my channel's Discord, we were speculating on the mysterious identity of this Tholindis that Rerir was screaming about. And we came up with a lot of interesting theories, all of which pointed back to the idea that Tholindis is most likely the name of one of the moons. Probably Solnari, aka Sonnet, aka the iridescent moon. Probably. Just to share a couple of fun examples, Hyde pointed out that Thol is Old Norse for fir tree, while Lind could both refer to shields, linden trees, or even a lindworm. So in that case, lindworm would be a dragon association, which would make sense because the moons are a creation of the dragons. Along those same lines, Nave pointed out that Dis denotes a female Nordic deity, while Tholin is a type of organic compound formed by solar or cosmic radiation. And Tholin polymers are generally reddish, providing a link between the crimson moon and Tholin. What I find interesting about this is that tholins are thought to be ingredients for the so-called primordial soup conditions that allowed for the creation of life on Earth. All of these circumstantial clues, plus the fact that Rerir screams Tholindis' name and he's also the Rasher of Solnari, or hunter of the moon named Solnari, points to the possibility that Tholindis is another name for Solnari, which we already know is another name for Sonnet. And if we assume that all of these connections work together really well, then we could maybe say that Tholindis is like a tree from which the conditions of life are made. And that would make the fact that Rerir's weapon is called Barnstalker pretty funny, because a Barnstalker is a guardian tree that's associated with childbirth. So, two trees of life. Imagery that seems to be associated with entities that are related to death. Anyway, I thought that was a fun idea. But okay, back to the Hymns of the Far North, because we haven't talked about the newest names for the second and third Descenders, and that's kind of a big lore drop. Let's start with the second Descender, who we've been calling Voyager for the last few patches. Now, Voyager is an incredibly old space traveler astral projecting their spirit throughout the universe from some unknown location. She was quite fond of Nibelung, yay for space besties, so when she found out that his planet had been conquered by the first Descender, aka the Heavenly Principles, aka Pitkamunin, she indwelled within the body of a young man, courted the first angel Koitar, and launched a rebellion against Teyvat's new ruler from the golden city of Hyperborea. Now, Hymns of the Far North calls Voyager Soidervoinen, which is another title for the Finnish deity Samsa Pellervoinen, Samsa for short. Samsa was a vegetation deity, the creator of trees, and a god who sleeps all winter with his plants only to awaken alongside them every spring. Now, if you did the Hiisi Island world quests, you'll learn that Voyager was responsible for creating the Sampo Mill, which in Teyvat is kind of like a matter synthesizer ripped straight out of Star Trek. It's not a perfect comparison, but you get the idea, right? This is actually a pretty good reimagination of the Sampo mill that's found in Finnish folklore, since the Sampo mill was able to create infinite grain, gold, and salt from basically nothing. However, in Finnish folklore, it wasn't Sampsa who made the Sampo, but Ilmarinen, which in this case would be Nibelung. And that leads me to believe that the Voyager created or altered their version of the Sampo based on Nibelung's work or technology. And in fact, we know that Koitar taught the Voyager the, quote, secrets behind the powers of creation, so he likely made the Sampo based on that information. Now, I do want to point out that this reattribution of the Sampo's creation from Ilmarinen to Sampsa within the context of Teyvat actually isn't too far off base, because Sampsa was often said to sow the fields using seeds and grain taken from the Sampo, so there is a legitimate connection there. In addition to this, it's worth mentioning that the folklore Sampo is sometimes equated to the Finnish equivalent of a world tree, where it mills gold and other such things as the world rotates around its axis, which is the Sampo mill. And like I said, Sampsa is credited as being the creator of trees, hence Sampo tree, creator of trees, you get the idea. Now, there is a lot more to be said about the myth of the Sampo and everything around it and its relevance to the game, but I am saving that for another video, because when I say there's a lot, I mean there's a lot. So that brings us to Descender number 3, who now has a name, Saralainen. Now, technically speaking, Saralainen isn't actually the name of any deity. It's just a name that means islander, but it is sometimes used in the Kalevala as another name for the culture hero, Lemminkainen. Lemminkainen's story is actually quite long, but there's one portion of it in particular that I think fits really well with the story of the third Descender. So in the Kalevala, Lemminkainen travels to the wintry lands of Pohjola, where its ruler, the witch Louhi, offers him her daughter's hand in marriage if he can accomplish a certain amount of tasks. One of these tasks is killing a swan that's floating in the river of death, and while he's out there trying to hunt down the swan, he ends up getting torn into a bunch of little pieces that sink to the bottom of the river. Eventually, his mother finds out, dredges all his bits up from the bottom of the river, and pieces him back together again. If this story sounds familiar to you, it's because in the Hymns of the Far North, it says that Saralainen was supposed to marry the daughter of Pakasuko before the heavenly principles ripped him into pieces. You know, the pieces that became the 7 Gnosis. Now, Pakasuko is another name for Grandfather Frost, since Pakas means frosty and Uko means old man, father, or grandfather. Both Grandfather Frost and Pakasuko are other names for Dead Miraz, the personification of winter. Now, Dead Miraz actually has a daughter or granddaughter named Snegurochka, who is most likely the Tsaritsa equivalent in Genshin, which means that the third Descender was the Tsaritsa's lover at one point. And I say this because Pakasuko is most certainly supposed to be the Belyi Tsar, who preceded the Tsaritsa, and the Tsaritsa was already identified as his daughter. And Snegurochka's name has already appeared in Genshin. You can find it in the Ballad of the Fjords, where she's described as Ajax's lover. And no, not this Ajax, but the historical one, the hero Ajax, which means that the third Descender is probably the original Ajax. Or Aias, I guess you could say his name either way. Incidentally, Snegurochka's stories generally seem to involve her meeting a rather grisly end and, melting as a result. In one story, she falls in love with a shepherd and eventually melts because her heart grew too warm. So I'm assuming that the shepherd in this case is the third Descender, so Saralainen. And we know that the Tsaritsa is gathering all of the Gnosis, and the Gnosis are the remnants of the third Descender, and that's pretty reminiscent of how Lemminkainen's mother tried to put him back together again after he was split into a bunch of pieces. So all things considered, it does sound pretty likely that the Tsaritsa is trying to resurrect the third Descender. And this whole situation is incredibly funny once you realize that Lemminkainen is often called Loverboy. Not just because a lot of his stories involve a lot of romance, but because he's the son of Lempo. Lempo should be a very familiar name for you, since it's one of the regions in Nod-Krai that's found in Luna 1. And no, it's not part of Hymns of the Far North, but I want to talk about it anyway. Lempo or Lemitar is a deity that's connected to the negative aspects of love, which is why I find this whole Lemminaikin, aka Loverboy, son of Lempo, and also the third Descender who is gonna marry the Tsaritsa, just really funny. Now, as a deity of love, some scholars like Ganander liken Lempo to the demon Asmodeus, because Asmodeus was known for cursing people with infidelity. This is a loose connection at best, but our fourth missing shade, Asmodee, is based on Asmodeus, and she has a rather unique relationship to the traveling twins, and according to Istroth, she, quote, loves her new master more than herself, allegedly. Because of this, I find the fact that the twins' spaceship landed on Lempo Isle to be rather suspicious, especially since the word Lempo literally means ball lightning and is used to describe falling meteorites, as well as the caves or craters that are formed as a result of the impact. These impact zones are called Lempo's caves or Lempo's holes, and the traveler's spaceship is often described as a falling meteorite. And wouldn't you know it, there just so happens to be a cave behind the space where the ship fell. In fact, at the end of Luna 1's Archon quest, Rerir can be seen entering that same cave. Meanwhile, Columbina seems to think that someone hid the spaceship intentionally, which is also really suspicious because, seriously, where would you even put a spaceship where no one could even find it, not even a moon goddess? Do you think it could be in an alternate space? Huh, Asmodee? I don't know. It could be a total coincidence, or it could be a +1 to the theory of the Traveler or the Abyss Twin being Asmodee's new master. Who knows? Matters of love aside, the deity Lempo has connections to blacksmithing, which is quite fitting given how this island is home to the Clink Clank Crumb-Kake craft shop. Although now that I think about it, Lempo's connections with love's negative aspects kind of makes me look at these broken or patchwork heart symbols of Aino's a little bit differently. When Aino was first revealed, tons of people thought she was based off of this Pokemon trainer, Iono. There's definitely some shared inspiration and some design elements going on here, but the name Aino comes from one of the most tragic characters found in the Kalevala. To TLDR the whole myth, basically, Aino was a young maiden who was being forced into a marriage with Väinämöinen. Remember him from earlier? She was technically the prize that Väinämöinen won after defeating her brother in a singing contest. But Aino wished to live as a young and free-spirited maiden forever, unmarried, and was thus so distraught at the prospect of marriage that she ended up drowning in a lake, in some versions intentionally and in others accidentally. Sometimes this results in her becoming a mermaid, nixie, or other water fae, which is probably why our playable Aino is Hydro. Our Aino also had an exceptionally troubling childhood and seemingly lost all of her will to live until she fell in love with building machines. Now she considers those machines to be her family, and frankly, that's kind of allegorically similar to how Kalevala's Aino became family with fish, in the sense that both Ainos feel most comfortable associated with non-humans. Aino's love of metalwork and machinery also likely stems from Lempo's association with blacksmithing, and I think that's pretty cool. Apart from Aino, Lempo Island is also home to a couple other fun references. The Eye of Kratti, for example, is named after a Krat, which is a Finnish beast that guards treasure, especially stolen treasure. And it just so happens that this is one of the locations where the thief Reed Miller hid one of his own treasures, a proof of cognoscenti. But that's a story for another time. Further north of the Eye of Kratti, you can find the Nothing Passage, which contains a very cryptic world quest and some notes describing some very questionable Fatui experiments. Now, I have no real basis for this, but I think the Nothing Passage is actually supposed to be named the No Thung Passage, which is another name for Graham, a dragon-slaying sword. Like I said, there's nothing really to back up this idea except for the fact that in the middle of this world quest, you kind of get yeeted through this void space, and there's like this giant broken sword-looking thing in it. I mean, it's actually like a three-pronged thingamabob, but I do think that Hoyo shows us this particular angle on purpose. Partially because the No Thung blade is pretty important in the ring cycle, and Hoyo loves referencing that opera. That said, the quest itself is actually a reference to the Lovecraftian story Color Out of Space, where some colors descended from the sky and sucked the color and life out of everything within a large radius. The colors then tried to return to the sky from whence they came, but some of it still lingered behind. As weird as this quest was, I think the weirdest part is the Fatui's description of this like bug-eyed goat that's just staring out into space, seemingly entranced by some invisible hallucination. I've been wondering if that's a reference to how sometimes creatures can be totally transfixed by the moon. Cause like that note ends by mentioning that the goat's blood is green, which immediately reminded me of a passage from The Little Witch and the Undying Fire that also talked about how the original race of the world, the Nephilim, had green blood, and they also worshipped a blood green moon. So I'm kind of starting to think that maybe lunar radiation from the Kuvaki could literally turn blood green somehow. Anyway, I think that's enough Lempo Isle for now. Let's move on to Paha. Actually, if I'm honest, I don't really have much to say about Paha. All I can really find on Paha is that they were a demonic cohort of Lempo, and their name means evil in like a bajillion different variations. So we have Paha Isle, which is home to a Fatui base and also a graveyard for people who fight against the evil Wild Hunt. It's pretty on the nose, and there's not much more to say here, so maybe I'm just gonna use this as an excuse to talk about Flins, who looks like an evil demonic entity, but isn't. Flins seems to take his name from the Slavic deity called Flins. Or perhaps I should say alleged Slavic deity. Most scholars seem to be convinced that Flins isn't actually a real deity at all, and was maybe just a king at some point, and claim that Boda probably just made him up in a book that he wrote. Which is funny, because Flins' current identity is also a complete fabrication, and he is, or was technically, nobility of some sort. Again, pretty on the nose. Hoyo really went out of their way to execute Flins as literally as possible, because in his book, Conrad Boda apparently described this alleged deity as a, quote, deceased figure wearing a long cloak, holding a staff, and a burning torch. So they gave him a ghostly appearance, a long coat, a spear, and a lantern, and made him a former noble. Now, questionable origins of a deity aside, Flins does seem to also take inspiration from the Finnish will-o-wisps, which are called Arnivolkia, who are considered among the Fae, and Flins is indeed a Fae, and also seems to be very will-o-the-wispy since he can literally just go inside his lantern, or just is his lantern. I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. But he's also not out yet, so I'm sure we're gonna learn more about him later. Oh, but I do want to talk about a predecessor of his, the very first Lightkeeper, Solovei. Solovei was a close childhood friend of the infamous thief Reed Miller, so it should surprise no one that he takes his name from a Russian folktale called Solovei the Robber, or Nightingale the Robber, since Solovei literally means nightingale. And this is why the Lightkeepers are sometimes called Warriors of the Nightingale. They're following in Solovei's footsteps. I found a copy of the tale online, which you can find in my citations document if you're interested in reading this tale for yourself. I really only want to highlight one detail beside the, parallel between both of these guys being thieves. And that is that Nightingale the Robber appears to have been some sort of magic bird with dragon-esque fire breath that he spews at his enemies from high up in a tree. And this amuses me greatly because Solovei received the Arrow of Turpicuranis from the Frostmoon Scions and eventually retrofitted this ancient piece of draconic technology into the Lightkeeper's lighthouse. And it shoots beams of light at the abyss. It's just like the bird shooting fire at people from a tree, assuming that the tree is the lighthouse tower. Although it's not really fire in our case because Turpicuranos appears to be an epithet for Zeus, which may explain why Flins is electro instead of pyro, thunder god, and all that jazz. Now, as I already mentioned, Solovei was a close childhood friend with Reed Miller, master thief and founder of the Treasure Hoarders. I have a whole video about Reed Miller coming up, so I won't dive too deep into his story, but I do need to give you a small amount of context for the use of Raven as his symbol. And it has to do with his origins, which is kind of in spoiler territory, but only a little bit. So Reed Miller's origins are actually a little bit murky. Like, the game isn't explicitly clear on where he came from, which is part of the reason why I'm making a whole video about it. But the results of my investigation seem to suggest that he was born to a Frostmoon Scion mother and a Snezhnayan father. And I think the fact that Reed Miller chose a raven to represent him corroborates this hypothesis. And I know you might think I'm crazy, but in Finnish folklore, the raven was a bird that was born of Lempo and Hiisi. And you remember Lempo, right? The deity of destructive love and metalwork? We'll talk about the deity Hiisi in a little bit, but the Frostmoon Scions do live on Hiisi Island, and Lempo is where Nashatown and most of Nod-Krai's settlements are. So to me, this suggests that Reed Miller was born of Hiisi and Lempo, so a Frostmoon Scion and a Snezhnayan father. And the lore that we have seems to corroborate that as well. But that would take a really long time to explain, so we're not going to do that. I found this information about the raven in a book of Finnish folk songs that go over a lot of the origins of things, and I just thought it was too cool not to include. But we're done with this for now, so let's move on and talk about Hiisi Island. So in Finnish folklore, Hiisi is considered a deity, or a kind of nature spirit associated with like hills. But they may not have originally started out that way, because it seems like Hiisi was originally a term used to describe a sacred location that was inhabited by spiritual entities like nymphs, trolls, or other types of fae. In fact, the name literally means sacred grove of trees on a hill, which suits the island of Hiisi rather well. So perhaps the word Hiisi has just come to mean any sort of spiritual or fae-like creature that would have dwelled in these kinds of locations. I don't have a whole lot more to share about Hiisi, but what I will add is that they did have a lot of strong associations with song magic. And I feel like that's very appropriate given how Columbina is very much into singing and she is their deity. And a lot of their oral traditions seem to be tied to hymns, hence Hymns of the Far North. This is also where you get the book, Hymns of the Far North. You find it on Hiisi Island in the Frostmoon Enclave. Speaking of which, it is very difficult to talk about Hiisi without mentioning Lauma. So I think it's Lauma time. Now, besides the antlers, the first prominent feature that people seem to notice about Lauma is her large chest area. Now, believe it or not, both of these things are quite lore accurate to her inspiration, the Lauma or the Laume. The Laume were celestial Latvian and Lithuanian goddesses who descended to to Earth once upon a time and are incredibly ancient, dating all the way back to the Mesolithic post-Ice Age period. So it's quite appropriate that the Frost Moon Scions that Lauma belongs to are associated with both ice and the ancient city of Hyperborea. Personally, I think Hyperborea might be similar to the land of Niflheim that the 8th Dragon Lord mentioned in passing. It's a little hard to say for certain, but she does identify the moon wheel as a ritual item given to the human followers of the moons in Niflheim, so it's probable that she's talking about people like the Frost Moon Scions since they lived in the city of Hyperborea to the far north and they worshipped the moons. Just saying. Anyway, the Lauma are considered to be one of the Fae, and in many ways they're quite like the Greek satyrs and centaurs, except they are predominantly female and they can also take the shape of many animals, notably goats and deer, hence the horns. They were also notoriously large-breasted, hence Lauma's, yeah. In addition to all of the above, the Lauma were also incredibly skilled weavers, and they often appear in threes, so they're often connected to triple goddess archetypes. Considering the fact that the moons of Genshin are also triple goddesses and are associated with the weaving of Tevat's fate, a Lauma makes for a perfect priestess. And finally, I think we should wrap up this mythology primer by talking about why this region is even called Nod-Krai in the first place. From what I can tell, the name Nod-Krai references two things. The first is the biblical land of Nod found in the book of Genesis. Nod is best known for being the place where Cain was exiled to after he killed his brother Abel and was rejected by the grace of God. And that's because the land of Nod notably lacked the presence of God, which made it a perfect safe haven for wanderers, exiles, and fugitives, or just those who forsake God. Which I realize sounds a bit silly since technically speaking, the Frost Moon Scions were the first settlers of Nod-Krai and are thus considered its natives, and they worship a moon goddess. But it is noteworthy that Columbina, or Kutar, isn't one of Tevat's 7 gods. In many ways, she too is in exile. Now, as for the Krai part of the Nod-Krai name, it's actually a term used to describe a territory of Russia, and in the case of Nod-Krai, it's most likely referring to Finland, since Finland became a part of the Russian Empire following the Finnish War of 1808 until it declared independence in 1918. Admittedly, Krai isn't a term only used for Finland, but given all the other references to Finnish history, culture, and mythology that we've gone over today, I do think it's a safe bet. This name also lends some insight into the kind of relationship that Nod-Krai has with Snezhnaya, since the latter takes heavy inspiration from Russia. And I think that'll do it for today. Now, I don't know if you guys find mythology guides as fun as I do, but if you made it this far, I hope you at least learned something fun. And if you didn't, well, stay tuned for a big old theory coming up that's based on all of the mythology that I didn't cover today. Let me tell you, it's gonna be a doozy. But I think now it is time for me to sign off, so thank you all so much for watching, take care of yourselves out there, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye-bye.